Dear colleagues and friends, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you all, and thank you for being here, even if presently being here means being elsewhere. Nearby and afar have merged under present conditions, whilst the virtual spaces thankfully still meet real time. Let me thank you, Parvati and Matthew, for your most kind and generous words of introduction and for presiding over this inaugural with a difference. Indeed, it happens to be my fourth inaugural in this country and with a biologically conditioned likelihood, my final one. But you never know these days. Given this special occasion, I have more than good reason to thank my dear colleagues in German here at the Queen Mary and the School of Languages, Linguistics and Film for exemplary collegiality over the years and decades. This is a real time giveaway, I'm afraid. Together with my predecessor as Centenary Professor of German, my friend Leonard Olschner. Let me also thank all the helping hands in the background for mastering the still considerable technical challenges this ever precarious virtual environment confronts us with. I would like to name Anne Bonaham, Kim Chang, and Jana Riedl. And finally, let me thank most warmly our young musicians who will provide us at the end, as Matthew said, of this evening with an artistic aura so much needed these days, as indeed always. For life without music, to quote Nietzsche's famous phrase, would be but an error. We have learned from whom else but Goethe that poetry and thought, the imagined and the visual, meet in the symbol. But the symbol can also resound. One of E.T.A. Hoffmann's protagonists even imagined the sun as a triad from which star-like chords would fire down on us. And with that, we have already tonight's keyword, the triad, in its symbolic and real meaning, perhaps even as an opening to the examination of geometrical forms and their bearings on structures in the respective arts. There is an indisputable fascination with the third as an uneven but evocative number. It is evidenced by a telling difference in two Anglo-German proverbial expressions. The English saying, two is company, three is none, stands against the German allegedly favoring threesomeness as epitomized by Schiller's ballad, Die Bürgschaft, or The Pledge, with its plea, Ich sei gewährt mir die Bitte in eurem Bunde der Dritte. I should like to be, do grant me this plea, the third in your midst. Irony has it that the young Franz Schubert, following his setting of this ballad for voice and piano in 1815, tried to turn this into a full-scale opera, only to break it off a year later, but where of all places? In the third act. The suggestive appeal of the third as an artistic figuration comes into play even in contemporary fiction when, for instance, Janet Winterson called her prose, Art and Lies, a piece for three voices, meaning in this case present-day transfigurations of the mere names Handel, Sappho, and Picasso that allude to the three main forms of art, music, poetry, and painting. The gender identity of her three protagonists is distinctly unstable, if not permanently in flux. At the end of her exploration of this triangle, she even quotes the score of the trio for three female voices that concludes the opera Der Rosenkavalier by Richard Strauss, suggesting that it is the interplay of three voices that provides the only form of threesome stability. On the subject of the attraction of the third, take Leonid Massin's ballet El Sombrero de Tres Picos, or The Three-Cornered Hat, with music by Manuel de Falla, with its central dance, the Farruca, dominated by three wind solo instruments, the horn, the oboe, and the bassoon. It is as if these literary and musical voices and instruments are singling out themselves in various acts of attempted self-assertion, and at the same time seeking a balance based on interacting with one another whilst each tries to avoid being the odd one out. But let us not digress any further into the rich and admittedly alluring or tempting contexts of tonight's subject matter and duly focus on our trio of exceptionally perceptive, impressionable and creative minds, Beethoven, Hegel and Hölderlin. When they were at the threshold of their intellectual maturity at the age of 19, news of a revolution in France had reached them. Beethoven in Bonn, then a viola player in the court orchestra, Hegel and Hölderlin as friends and fellow students in Tübingen's so-called Stift, an elitist nursery for future Protestant clergy, and at the same time a place that was gaining a reputation for revolutionary sympathies among its students, much to the dismay of this educational institution's patron, the Duke of Württemberg. They were evidently inspired by three highly charged concepts: liberté, égalité, fraternité, together with a banner displaying three evocative colors: bleu, blanc, rouge. The fact that a Catholic clergyman, the Vicar General in the Diocese of Chartres, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, should have published one of the intellectual triggers that led to the revolution, Qu'est-ce que le tiers état? What is the third estate? Would have been registered with some relish by these three young men, given their own, albeit very different, affiliation with clerical matters. Sieyès' pamphlet would have reached them as a, shall we say, samizdat at the time, offering three provocative and rhetorically apt questions. What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. The poet and musician Hölderlin and Beethoven would have appreciated the rhythmic structure of this sequence of questions, whereas the to-be philosopher Hegel would have derived intellectual pleasure from this example of free thinking. After all, it was Hegel who would later come up with the formula: to philosophize means to learn how to live and think freely, far removed from any dogmatism. At the time of the outbreak of the French Revolution, both the young Hölderlin and Hegel wrestled with Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason, which had come out exactly 1 year before this momentous event, whilst young Beethoven studied at that time scores by Mozart, Gluck and Paisiello. A year later, Joseph Haydn would interrupt his voyage to London in Bonn, and the meeting between the two would pave the way for Beethoven's, in artistic terms, crucial move to Vienna in 1792, when anti-revolutionary warfare threatened to destabilize Beethoven's existence in Bonn. This said, our three aspiring youngsters would have sensed that the trio of these persuasively reverberating concepts, liberty, fraternity, equality, even though later perverted by Robespierre's reign through terror, together with the three colors of the tricolore, signaled a decisive move towards de-Christianization and thus secularization of the spiritual conception encapsulated in the Holy Trinity. It might be helpful to briefly consider this powerful dogma before we look at the marked traces it left in the works of both Beethoven, Hölderlin and Hegel, albeit in musically, poetically and intellectually transformed manifestations. Of all three monotheistic religions, only the Christian faith has established the dogma of the Holy Trinity, as formulated and formalized during the Council of Nicaea, 325 after Christ. In it, its third element is declared purely spiritual. The Holy Ghost, whether dove-shaped or concentrated as a ray of divine light, appears the least tangible, besides the conception of a Father and a Son. This third quality adds to the ineffability of what the Trinity really is or represents. The Christian calendar reserves 2 days of celebrating the emanation of the Spirit, known as Pentecost, which was made to coincide symbolically with one of the holiest days in Judaism, the Shavuot, meaning the revelation of the Torah and a harvest festival. In Western culture, the triadic model of history, as developed by Joachim of Flora in the second half of the 12th century in Palermo, must be regarded as one of the most enduring models of time structures associated with the conception of a history of culture. Even in the 20th century, the conception of a three-part progression in spiritual and cultural formations occupied theological and philosophical thoughts alike, from Ernst Bloch to Karl Löwit, from Henri de Lubac to Joseph Ratzinger. Fatefully, though, radical right-wing political ideology nationalized the notion of the third in the terrifying shape of a prophecy-fulfilling Third Reich. The triadic conception of history includes progressive alienation from a state of an allegedly blissful original unity of all phenomena and experiences, as well as the eventual overcoming of this alienation through the combined forces or powerful emanation of the Trinity. In this respect, the triadic models of cultural development and that of consciousness attempt to merge historical and utopian thought. Like with other aspects of religious dogma, the secularization, let alone its political perversion of the triadic model, could only have occurred because it contained a strong worldly feature in the first place, represented by the incarnation of the Spirit in the shape of Christ. The other fundamental rationale for triadic patterns of thought consisted of the three categories of existence, as Hegel was to emphasize even in his very last lectures, given in Berlin in 1829-1830, on the history of philosophy and the logic that informed its terminology: being, nothingness, and becoming. Triadic structural patterns in Beethoven, Hegel, and Hölderlin dominate their mature works. Beethoven's resounding contribution to the aesthetic appropriation of the triad as a secular musical representation of the Holy Trinity is contained in his trio compositions, for instance, in the piano trio Opus 70, number 1 in D major, aptly termed in retrospect by his pupil Carl Czerny, the Ghost, or should one say in retro here, for it was in 1842 when Czerny stated that the second movement of this trio distinctly reminded him of the ghost scene at the opening of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Beethoven's mastery of the trio was such that he pioneered its symphonic extension in the shape of his triple concerto, Opus 56 in C major, published in 1807. It sounds as if the solo instruments are given the license to assert themselves. Their prominence is much stronger than in traditional concerti concertanti, in which the parts for the soloists are more integrated into the narrative of the orchestra, as it were. The triple concerto, however, regards the orchestra more as an acoustic backdrop or mere amplifier against which the voices of the three solo instruments come into their own, thus indicating their partial emancipation from the musical whole. Music speaks through the performed realization of a notated musical idea, even though it remains inevitably unclear what exactly she says when she speaks. A fundamental paradox in music is the utter precision of the notation and the ineffable meaning that it denotes. The more suggestive a piece of music sounds, the more tempting it is to attribute a particular concept to it. Beethoven's music is full of such examples, from the Pastoral Symphony with various evocative headings for its movements, to the Capriccio for piano, opus 129, The Rage over a Lost Penny. What Hegel intimated with the active role of developing concepts, Beethoven seemed to have associated with the musical idea that emerges from within a chord or musical phrase. One might also call it a germinating sound or tonal seed. With such connotations, we are in the midst of romantic musical aesthetics that rejected any further formalization of musical rhetoric or compositional tropes or topoi, and it worked distinctly with analogies and similes. But in structural terms, Beethoven adhered to traditional patterns which he revolved from within. The triadic structure is one such example that gained prominence, as said, in his piano trios, the triple concerto, and almost emblematically in his Missa Solemnis in D major, opus 128, which he himself regarded as the pinnacle of his artistic achievement. One of the striking features in the opening Kyrie of the Missa, to which I will limit our deliberations in this particular case, only 3 of the 4 vocal soloists, the tenor, soprano, and the alto, engage in an interplay with the chorus over the mono-verbal beginning, as it contains nothing but the word Kyrie, have pity, an imperative in the form of a lament. In terms of tempi, Beethoven prescribes an assai sostenuto, with repeated tonic chords and complete absence of melodic motion. It is at this point where we need to consider the other 2 translations of Trinitas in German, namely Dreieinigkeit and Dreifaltigkeit. Whilst the former emphasizes unity within Trinity, the latter implies its unfolding. And it is precisely this notion of unfolding that Beethoven captures in the opening Kyrie of his Missa. This opening comes on a weak beat, referring to a deity that is free from the dynamics of human passions, apatheia. It is the quite rare paradox of a movement that lingers in motionlessness and seems to border a standstill. This is followed by the 3rd part of the Kyrie representing the Holy Spirit by way of allusion to a 3rd voice. The overarching chorus offers a binding musical element which confines itself to repetition and inward movements. We will now change the musical key, indulge in some poetic modulation without abandoning the main theme. It was in 1954 when the fair copy of Hölderlin's Pindaric hymn, Friedensfeier, emerged from holdings of a London autograph dealer. One of this hymn's main poetic features is its triadic structure, 4 times 3 stanzas with 12 verses per each stanza. It turned out to be one of the most commented on of Hölderlin's major poems. In the context of triadic patterns of structure and intellectual conceptions, the much debated question regarding the identity of this hymn's pivotal figure, the Fürst des Festes, the master of festivities, is essential. Following the peace treaty of Lunéville in 1801, Napoleon was believed to have been Hölderlin's master of the festivity. Others argued that Hölderlin was alluding to Christ or indeed to peace itself as this very master. In an allegorical sense, the Jüngling, the young man, often referred to in the hymn, could indeed be seen as an embodiment of peace, given that in the bellicose days of Hölderlin's time, peace was indeed seen as a, or perhaps the, newcomer. The hymn even suggests that a mother and child are actually watching peace, as if peace were a living creature. Furthermore, reference is made to eine heilige Zahl, a sacred number or figure that is likely to refer to the Trinity, or indeed, in the case of the 12 stanzas, to the 12 apostles. Without wishing to overstretch the argument, it appears that the master of festivities, der Fürst des Festes, is a threefold composite figuration consisting of both Christ, peace, and Napoleon. As the first stanza indicates, the very space where the festivities will take place is full of resonating heavenly sounds that imbue the atmosphere of this celebration of peace. Hölderlin does not religiously follow a triadic formation of historical time. Rather, he translates these threefold periods within history into the poetic structure of the poem. It is now not so much the sequentialization of three periods in human history that constitutes the triad, but the three poetic entities stand for, or arguably are, these very periods. For the overriding concern of this poem is to establish harmony and overcome dissonances. In this process, as the hymn suggests in its 8th stanza, discourse turns into song, or Gesang, containing the images of reconciliation and equilibrium. The presence of the festivities, or rather the all-absorbing preparations for them, incorporates historical and visionary elements. Seeing peace enacted by a celebration, remembering where it comes from, namely from a gruesome world of conflict, and suggesting ways into a trouble-free future seem to guarantee an intricate unity of these three temporal parts. Similarly, Immanuel Kant developed thoughts on the subject of eternal peace. We have to see this almost in tandem. But just how overbearing the past could still be becomes evident when we consider that the most worrying realization in this hymn is expressed through a composite neologism, unheard of in German. Furchtbar entscheidend, ein tödlich Verhängnis. Furchtbar entscheidend for Hölderlin is one word, ein tödlich Verhängnis. In Michael Hamburger's rendering, a dreadfully determining deadly doom overshadows you there. In order to escape this deadly doom, whose origins remain opaque, we need to sustain our Gesang, the inner music, so to speak, or the poetic aspiration to realize the saving grace of the triad, time and again. Gesang is the poetic synthesis, the very third element that brings together and contains the extremes of worldly and indeed psychological experiences. And Hegel? There is evidence from an early internalization of the third as a fundamental principle in the young Hegel, when he gave a surprising measure for the duration of a glance. The duration of a glance. He writes, keine Terze lang. This is what he says in his diary about a venture into the Alps off Bern in Switzerland. Not a tierce long. That is musical time turned optical. Indeed, a philosophical challenge of a small scale, but with much wider implications. Arguably, Hegel's concern with the dialectical structure of thought betrayed the fact that he had internalized triadic principles, in particular with reference to his notion of the synthesis and what that actually means, what it entails. Crucially, Hegel considered and worked with the threefold meaning of the word aufgehoben in German, for it suggests to remove or to abolish, for example, a particular law, to preserve, being the opposite of abolish, and to elevate to another level of meaning. The particular feature of Hegel's notion of dialectics is the fluid interplay of these meanings when determining the function of a synthesis. It is not difficult to see an analogy between this threefolding of meaning and Hegel's conception of the three stages in the philosophy of the mind, so important to him, and its developmental history. Here too, the triadic structure prevails, consisting of the following stages. The mind, or in Hegel's terms, the world spirit, finds itself in a state of an sich sein, or being itself and being as such. In the second stage, the mind reaches a state of self-utterance, Entäußerung, as he puts this, or self-alienation or otherness. As part of this stage or phase, the mind emanates in space and time, thus in nature. And this, according to Hegel, is where the philosophy of nature begins. The third and final stage sees the mind returning to itself. It focuses on its own needs enriched by previous experiences. But what is it then that triggers this development? Initially, it is the tension between being and nothingness. They do not cancel each other, but propel the mind to enter the sphere of self-realization in other forms, that is, space and time. Such self-realization could be termed the self-othering of the mind. This in itself is the precondition for the mind regaining control over itself and acquiring at least some objectivity in the way in which it perceives itself. Hegel's explication of this self-perception of the mind was to be content of his phenomenology of the mind, and also indeed the very contents of its ambition. Similarly, in the first part of his lectures on the philosophy of law, 1818 to 1831, a considerable span by Hegel's standards for one work, known as the Heidelberg Encyclopedia, Hegel was to retain the structural triad of philosophical thought, comprising of logic, understood to be the science of reason, and self-liberation through free thinking, philosophy of nature, and the philosophy of the mind. The very sound of this triad was that of a finely tuned attempt to make subject and object converge. The other tripartite field of investigation is in Hegel's world of thought, art. He argues in the introduction to his lectures on aesthetics that art invites us to an intellectual form of perception, calling it denkende Betrachtung. Interestingly, he adds that this should not lead to generating new art, but to challenge us to recognize ontologically what art actually is. Hegel regards art as something between the sensual and thought, or between nature and the mind. In this capacity, it represents a third whereby it is unclear whether it can be called a synthesis at all. But given what was said before, it would be fair to assume just that. Art is and represents an ideal interplay of the aforementioned three qualities of Aufhebung, namely preservation, elevation, and the removal of opposites for the sake of finding new forms of expression. In his Kunstphilosophie, the philosophy of art, Hegel positions art right between the perceiver and the perceived, or the subject and object. Therefore, art features as the third component in the triangular structure of creativity. The whole point about Hegel's by now evident adoption or even internalization of triadic modes of thought is that he regards philosophy as the legitimate heir to theology. The logos of the mind has replaced any deities, but retained the Trinitarian structure of belief, translating it into a methodology of critiquing any creeds. With Hegel, the dogma of the Holy Trinity turned first into an object of intellectual investigation and then into the latter's structure. It is important to see that these three elements of and stages in the intellectual process as a continuum of flowing interactions somehow perpetuated itself. The inner logic of these progressions does not make any jumps. Logos non fecit saltus. Regardless whether the development of consciousness is viewed as gradual or jumpy, it constitutes a movement of sorts and in turn keeps the components of the triad in the mind moving. In Hegel, this triad consists of consciousness, awareness of oneself and reason. In the language of Hegel's phenomenology, this colossal Education intellectuelle or Bildungsroman of the spirit, of the mind, behind culture, knowledge, and intellectual self-determination, this triad within the pure mind is completed, complemented, to a certain extent supplemented by subjective imagination. The interaction between these triadic structures is not automatic, but the result of enacted freedom on part of the subject or the Ich. During the process of such interaction, forms of hybridization in the mind and also in language are not only possible, but likely, meaning that through imagination, the boundaries of, say, reason and phenomenon, consciousness and self-assertiveness can become blurred. It is at this point where Hegel's famous conception of the Arbeit des Begriffs, or the working of concepts, comes into play. This notion represented a major breakthrough in philosophical thought that affected virtually all disciplines and discourses in the humanities thereafter. Hegel recognized that concepts create their own conceptions and verbal contexts, and in that sense work towards their own further development or indeed self-transformation. What he meant was the realization of the potential within a concept, evidencing the freedom in creativity of whatever kind. In essence, this was also the common denominator of our three free spirits, celebrated as much in Beethoven's opera of Liberty, Fidelio, as in Hölderlin's early hymn on this very condition for a human existence, worthy of its name. Hegel insisted, though, on the ethics, even of artistic freedom, arguing that freedom without a strong sense of social responsibility, meaning obligation towards the other, could not claim to be called human or humane. Self-realization was the main creed of these three minds, whose incommensurable works testify to just that. But at 250, this trio makes us think about the crucial interplay between the resonances of the human soul in music, as composed by Beethoven, the meaning of peace and poetry as such, as exemplified by Hölderlin's hymn, and the necessity of perpetual reflection on the conditions of existence, as demonstrated by Hegel. Three very secular pursuits indeed, but mindful of the sacred value of being. In conclusion, it might be condonable to depart yet again, albeit briefly, from our trio at 250 somewhat, and refer to a related concern with a third in a more time-oriented context. In the first of the four quartets, Bernd Norton, T.S. Eliot's lyrical self famously muses. Time present and time past are both, perhaps, present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. These verses offer a temporal triad which in itself creates a threefold poetic space for its components, present, past, and future, containing each other and interacting in a trialectic manner. In Eliot's semi-stanza, a binary opposition prevails and cannot be resolved. It is the opposition between unredeemability and eternal presence, except that the very fact of the existence of unredeemable temporal relations has created a time space for its eternal presence and eternal possibilities. As a counterpoint to Eliot's poetic exploration of temporality, serves, in my view, Friedrich Schiller's poem Spruch des Konfuzius, saying by Confucius, with its threefold experience of time. Dreifach ist der Schritt der Zeit, zögernd kommt die Zukunft hergezogen, pfeilschnell ist das Jetzt entflogen, ewig still steht die Vergangenheit. Threefold is the step of time, future comes with hesitation, arrow-like the new flew off, the past stands still eternally. This is a distinctly Western interpretation of the Confucian conception of time, incidentally set as a canon for three voices, again by the young Franz Schubert in 1813. It emphasizes the present in which the past and future are contained. This is reflected in the Chinese language with its absence of grammatical tenses other than the present. There, prepositions indicate temporal differentiation. In that sense, Eliot's time-oriented passage in Burnt Norton was closer to Confucius than Schiller's explicit claim to render Confucian ideas. With Confucius and Tao in particular, there is an eternal yet permanent fluidity of time within a perpetual present that resists the rigidity of temporal categories, a phenomenon, incidentally, that intrigued Hegel greatly when he began to explore towards the end of his life Chinese philosophy. What this all binds together is the sheer creativity of the mind, the artistic and intellectual creation itself. It is symptomatic for the spirit of the time we live in that we feel almost embarrassed to use the word creation in artistic contexts and speak in the jargon of industrialists of art and knowledge production, as if we were afraid of accepting the specificity and specialness of particular elements of our culture consists of. Perhaps it is time to refer more explicitly than ever to what the late George Steiner called the grammars of creation, one of his least quoted, but eminently challenging and thus inspiring works. So much for the absurdity of our so-called quotation indexes. It appears that the third element suggests harmonization, but as an uneven number, it indicates a more or less hidden desire to round things off and aspire to a fourth component to make matters and numbers even. In the chamber music repertoire, piano trios run the risk of having one instrument, the piano, most of the time stand out and dominate the two string players, an impression that rarely occurs, for example, with piano quartets. The challenge for the composer of such formations is or was to tame the part that is likely to dominate the others. If anything, this brief exploration into the triadic structures and their dominance in works of these three iconic representatives of music, philosophy, and poetry around 1800 and beyond has perhaps helped to show just how significant this decidedly symbolic form has been in the process of secularization. The aesthetic and intellectual imagining and rendering of the triadic model of spirituality illustrates one concern all three, Beethoven, Hegel, and Hölderlin shared: emancipation from dogma, securing intellectual and artistic freedom as essential preconditions for preserving human dignity. Thank you all very much.
Please allow me to thank you, Professor Rüdiger Görner and Queen Mary's music scholars, for what has been a truly rich and resonant evening. Thank you, dear Rüdiger, for taking us through this amazing journey through the grammars of creation, and for sharing with us your absolutely brilliant insights into their work, and for bringing them together as well in such an amazingly harmonious way. It's been a wonderful experience in the darkness of autumn and pandemic. Thank you for this. I think we take away with us a lot to reflect on, not only in terms of the work and of these three great figures, but also because they are so seminal, absolutely seminal in terms of the history and development of Western thought, poetry, and music. So thank you for that. And what better way than to complement that lecture with the wonderfully sensitive and aesthetic rendering of Beethoven's work by Queen Mary's scholars of music. Thank you so much for that beautiful rendition of Beethoven. Finally, may I thank the many, many people who joined us here for this lecture. We would have loved to have been able to welcome you in person, as Professor Hilton said, but I think it's also wonderful to have had this event online, because so many people from so many different locations have been able to come together and to enjoy this illuminating evening. So thank you for being here, and thank you so much to all of you, and a very good evening.